When Roman legions marched home in triumph, the world cheered. Cities lined the streets, garlands hung from the marble walls, and the sound of trumpets filled the air. The conquerors rode in shining armor, their banners high, the spoils of war glimmering in the sunlight. But behind that spectacle of power walked the defeated, kings in chains, and beside them the queens who once ruled with grace and pride. For them, the parade was not a celebration. It was the beginning of a nightmare. The people of Rome shouted in joy, throwing flowers, praising their generals, believing they were witnessing the glory of civilization itself. Yet behind those cheers lay the cries of women who had lost everything: their thrones, their families, their freedom. The triumphant march was more than a victory. It was a message. Rome wanted the world to see what happened to those who dared to resist it. For the captive queens, death would have been mercy. Many were paraded through the streets, forced to walk barefoot behind chariots as the crowd mocked their fall from grace. Gold chains around their necks cut into their skin. Their royal robes were torn to rags. Their crowns melted down into coins to fund the next campaign. And when the parade ended, their suffering did not. The generals feasted, the crowds dispersed, and the women disappeared into the shadows of Rome, into dungeons, villas, or temples where their names were never spoken again. This was how Rome celebrated victory, with pageantry and pain, with songs that drowned out the silence of its victims. The empire that claimed to bring order to the world built its glory upon the humiliation of others. And while history remembers the generals and emperors who stood atop those golden chariots, it forgot the women who walked behind them, queens reduced to trophies, symbols of conquest and domination. If we only remember Rome's victories and not its victims, we misunderstand the empire itself. Because what the Romans did to the women of defeated kingdoms changed the course of history and revealed the cruelty behind their so-called civilization. These weren't acts of passion or vengeance. They were part of a system, one that turned human suffering into a ritual of power. The fate of these captive queens reminds us that every empire writes its story in glory, but the truth often lies in the tears of those it silenced. Rome's marble monuments still stand, but beneath them are the bones of those who paid the price for its greatness. To understand Rome's legacy, we must look beyond its triumphs, to the forgotten queens whose suffering shaped the empire's shadowed heart. The Roman triumph was the grandest celebration the ancient world had ever known. It was a parade of victory, a display of power, and a performance meant to remind every citizen that Rome ruled the world. Streets were swept clean, temples were adorned with flowers, and incense filled the air. Crowds gathered from dawn to see their heroes march through the city gates, led by priests chanting prayers and soldiers carrying golden standards. The generals stood tall on chariots gilded with silver and ivory, wearing purple cloaks and laurel crowns, symbols of divine favor and ultimate conquest. The people cheered as golden chariots rolled down the Via Sacra, but behind them walked the broken remnants of empires. Among them were kings in chains and queens stripped of their dignity. These royal captives were not merely prisoners, they were trophies. Rome used them as living proof of its dominance. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra once ruled a vast eastern kingdom and defied Rome itself. She commanded armies, rode horses into battle, and challenged emperors. But when her empire fell, she was brought to Rome in golden chains, paraded before the crowd that once admired her courage. The same people who cheered her defiance now mocked her defeat. After the triumph ended, her fate disappeared into silence, her name reduced to a footnote in Rome's long list of conquered rulers. Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, suffered a similar fate. She was dragged from the temple sanctuary in Ephesus where she had sought refuge, her hands bound as Roman soldiers led her through the streets. The crowd shouted her name, not out of respect but out of curiosity, as if she were a rare animal on display. She was executed on the steps of the temple, a queen turned into a warning. And far across Africa, the Numidian queens met the same cruel end, paraded through Rome's streets before vanishing forever into the darkness of history. To the Romans, this was civilization in action, law and order triumphing over chaos. They called it justice, destiny, divine will, but what it truly was humiliation made into spectacle. The empire that claimed to bring peace to the world did so by turning suffering into entertainment. Each parade was not only a show of military strength, but also a performance of dominance over the human spirit. The irony was painful. Rome, the so-called light of civilization, celebrated its victories with acts that stripped others of their humanity. The citizens who filled the streets saw gold, trophies, and triumphal arches. They did not see the tears, the fear, or the broken dignity of the women who walked in chains. The glory of Rome shone bright, but its brilliance came from the reflected agony of those it crushed beneath its chariots. The humiliation of Rome's captives was not a moment of chaos or cruelty born from rage. It was a system, carefully designed and approved by law. Every step of the process followed a ritual. The parades that filled the city were not simply victory celebrations. They were public ceremonies meant to reduce living people into symbols of Roman power. Captives were stripped of their royal clothes and jewelry, their crowns melted down, and their names erased from records. The generals leading the parade were showered with roses, while behind them, the conquered walked barefoot through dust and mockery. This wasn't passion or revenge, and it was policy. Rome turned human suffering into spectacle. Ancient historians wrote about it with chilling precision. Plutarch described the triumph of Aemilius Paulus, who led the defeated King Perseus of Macedon through the streets, his children weeping beside him as the Roman crowds cheered. Dio Cassius told of how Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe was dragged from her temple sanctuary and shown to the people before being executed. Livy, writing centuries earlier, mentioned how the generals decided the fate of their captives only after the applause had faded. Some were strangled, others enslaved, and the most valuable, often royal women, were handed over as property to senators or high-ranking officers. Rome recorded these acts not as crimes but as ceremonies of order. Once paraded, many captive queens faced a fate worse than death. Some were forced into marriages with their conquerors, unions meant to turn humiliation into alliance. Others were confined to temples under the pretense of holy service, where they lived in isolation until death, their former titles stripped away. Roman law was clear. Prisoners of war belonged to the state and, by extension, to the emperor. Under the jus gentium, the law of nations, captives lost all rights. They could be bought, sold, gifted, or used as political tools. A queen once worshipped in her homeland could, by Roman decree, become a slave in a senator's household. Archaeology confirms what the texts only hinted at. Inscriptions on marble slabs found near the Roman Forum record the sale of foreign women of noble blood. Jewelry fragments discovered in the ruins of old villas show signs of being violently removed. Clasps broken, gemstones pried out. In the cellars beneath ancient Rome, iron shackles have been unearthed, some designed small and delicate, clearly made for women. Even temple walls bear faint carvings of names: Greek, Egyptian, Numidian, scratched by captive hands hoping someone might remember them. This system of humiliation was not hidden. It was displayed openly, celebrated even. The empire needed it to remind its people of Rome's supremacy and to warn its enemies of what defiance would bring. Behind every triumphal arch stood the unspoken truth, that Rome's greatness was built not only on conquest, but on the suffering of those it silenced. The Roman world called it order. History remembers it as domination dressed in law. Not every captive queen accepted her fate in silence. Some defied Rome even in chains. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, once paraded through the streets in golden shackles, refused to bow her head. Ancient accounts suggest that after her capture she stood tall before the emperor, her voice calm and steady, declaring that her downfall was not weakness, but destiny. Later records say she lived out her years in Tibur, in a villa gifted to her by Rome itself. Whether she became a quiet prisoner or a symbol of defiance, no one truly knows. But her story survived because even Rome could not completely erase her courage. Cleopatra, too, chose her own end. When the legions closed in and her empire fell, she refused to be paraded through the streets as a trophy. Ancient writers like Plutarch and Dio Cassius claimed she took her life rather than let Rome claim her body or her dignity. To the Romans, she was a temptress, a warning against foreign queens who challenged their power. But behind their words was fear. Fear of a woman who refused to play the role of victim. Her death denied them their final spectacle. Most others were not so lucky. The names of hundreds of captive queens and noblewomen vanished from memory, erased by the very empire that enslaved them. Chroniclers who praised generals and emperors wrote little about the women who suffered because of them. To write about, Their pain was to stain the image of Roman virtue, so history stayed silent. Rome built monuments to its victories, not memorials for its victims. For every queen whose name survived, 100 others were lost, buried in unmarked graves or forgotten beneath layers of empire. History crowned Rome eternal, but its victims were buried without names. Yet bones and records whisper their truth beneath marble ruins. Archaeologists still uncover broken jewelry, shattered tablets, and grave markers that speak softly of those who endured. Through these fragments, we glimpse the people Rome tried to erase, women who once ruled, loved, and fought for their kingdoms. The empire called itself civilized, but its civilization was written in suffering. It redefined morality to justify domination, turning cruelty into order and conquest into virtue. The same pattern has repeated throughout time. Conquerors glorified, the conquered forgotten. We celebrate power and progress, but rarely pause to hear the voices crushed beneath them. The story of Rome's captive queens is not only about the past, it is a reflection of the present, a warning of how easily greatness can blind us to the cost it demands. When we glorify the conquerors and forget the conquered, we repeat the same injustice dressed in new names. True history is not written by victors, but by those brave enough to uncover the silence they left behind. We praise Rome for its greatness, its law, its art, and its order. We admire its monuments, its discipline, and its achievements that shaped the world for centuries. But beneath every triumphal arch lies the silence of those who were paraded, violated, and erased. The marble walls that still stand today were built on the pain of the forgotten. Every statue of an emperor hides the tears of those who knelt before him in chains. The empire's glory was real, but so was its cruelty. True history demands that we remember both. It is easy to look back and see only the brilliance, the roads, the cities, the armies that conquered the known world. Yet behind that brilliance lived the unspoken truth of those who paid the price for it. The queens who lost their crowns, the women who lost their names, the children who never returned home. Their suffering was not an accident of history. It was part of what made Rome powerful. Every triumph Rome celebrated was built upon another's loss. To understand the empire fully, we must face the uncomfortable truth that civilization often grows from conquest and silence. The ruins of Rome still attract millions, but few stop to think about the lives buried beneath those stones. When we walk through its forums and temples, we are also walking through the graves of the silenced. Their stories deserve to be told, not to condemn history, but to complete it. Remembering them does not take away from Rome's achievements. It simply reminds us that greatness without humanity is hollow. If you value stories that uncover the forgotten side of history, subscribe. It helps us bring light to the truths time tried to bury. Tell us, from where in the world are you watching this story? Your support keeps history alive, not as a legend told by victors, but as the shared memory of all who lived, suffered, and endured.